From Chicago's CAN TV, a look at the week's events is reported in the newspapers, in the blogs and online, and on radio and TV. This is Chicago Newsroom.
Well, hi there and welcome to Chicago Newsroom on this summer day. I'm Ken Davis, and maybe it's just the summer doldrums, but all the news from Springfield and the Chicago Public Schools this week seems to be what I would call incremental. I mean, another spat between Rauner and Madigan, this time over spending to nonprofits. Forrest Claypool's announcing another cut to central office staff. It's all pretty predictable, and I think we just got to let these guys have some time to see if they can come up with some serious solutions, and we'll check back with them in a week or two. So it's a perfect time to catch up on some really big stories we have not talked about for a while. President Obama announced a new clean air set of rules that could have profound impacts on Chicago and Illinois. And of course, he's President Obama, so his opponents are going to try to keep all this tied up in court, hoping to run out the clock on his administration. But what's really in that proposal? What does it really mean, and would it do any good? Could those aging nuke plants be an environmental asset after all these years, at least as far as their emissions go? Could we be seeing the end of coal generation as we know it? We seem to be getting a lot of fast, massive storms that dump huge amounts of rain and flash floods, and that's been putting more sewage than ever into the lake and rivers, believe it or not. So is the deep tunnel able to cope with all of this? What about that? And lead paint. We know how bad it is for the brain, but you might be surprised to see that even lead paint poisoning lines up with the pattern of disparities between our wealthiest and our poorest neighborhoods. Surprise, surprise. This is Chicago, right? Oh, and pet coke. We got to talk about pet coke at least for a moment or two, and Michael Hawthorne would be the guy to do that. He's been writing about these and lots of other environmental issues for the Tribune for years, right?
It seems like it, yeah, decades in some respects. It depends on the day, right?
And I'm just so glad that we were able to get you by yourself today because we had so much of this stuff to cover. So, President Obama has announced new air emission standards, and I'd like you to answer the simple question: which is it? Does his plan create thousands of new jobs, or does it wreck the economy?
Well, I think it might wreck what's left of the coal economy. How about that?
There you go.
Although the coal economy is doing that to itself,
yes,
and natural gas is doing that. The free market is doing that to the coal economy. Coal has been consolidating for many years. Automation cost thousands of jobs. If you look, in two of the main coal-producing states in the eastern part of the United States, Kentucky and West Virginia, you start with Ronald Reagan, and the jobs from coal generally have been going down steadily since then. Interestingly enough, actually have gone up under Obama.
Is that right?
Slightly.
Yeah.
In Illinois, we only have about 4,200 workers at last count working in coal mines. Most of the coal that's mined in Illinois is not even burned here, goes to other states. You once heard this talk about how we're sitting on top of the Saudi Arabia of coal, but coal has a lot of problems that come along with it when you burn it. First of all, there's the kind of pollution that causes the haze in the air and smog, and there's the problem with coal ash waste. We saw this in North Carolina and also in Tennessee, where these giant impoundments ruptured and led to miles of water pollution. And then you have the climate aspect, which is what the president's getting at here. Coal-fired power plants in the United States, a third of greenhouse gas emissions. They've started limiting that kind of pollution from cars and trucks. Really tough rules on that are being phased in over time. But coal-fired power plants, they've never been regulated in that respect. So that's what these rules get at.
It's really critical to sort of accent that thing that you just said about a third. Because, as you say, starting back in 1970, the environmental movement kind of went after all of you always go after the most obvious things first, right?
Sure.
The big pipe that, the purple stuff flowing into the river.
Right.
And somehow or other, the coal industry was clever enough, or the power industry working with the coal industry, clever enough to sort of stay in the background. And now we're suddenly at this point where you look at the inventory of what's in the air, and a third of it is coming from electric power generation.
Well, and a lot of those power plants date back to the Eisenhower administration.
Yes,
so what happened, if you're a tiny bit of environmental history, when the Clean Air Act was passed in 1970, signed by Richard Nixon, the utility industry said that a lot of these old clunkers weren't going to be around for much longer.
Right,
but
right.
they managed to keep them going. In many cases, playing off the environmental agencies against the rate-setting agencies.
Right.
A lot of those utilities or their successor companies ended up in court and ended up losing some really major cases where they had to improve the air emissions or the pollution coming out of their smokestacks. But now, in many respects, these new clean air rules that address climate pollution are finally catching up to some of these old clunkers.
And that's important because in the earlier days, again, you had to go after the really grotesque stuff, the mercury and all this stuff that's
or
going
the
into
giant
the air.
particles of soot that were coming out of
the stuff you can drink.
Relatively so. And what's interesting about what's happening in the energy economy in general right now is a lot of things are happening because of regulations. In 1990, the Congress passed amendments to the Clean Air Act and said you need to start doing something about toxic air pollutants. One of those pollutants is mercury. So there's been this ongoing rulemaking that started under Bill Clinton and dragged out for many years through the courts, ultimately upheld, although just recently remanded back to the EPA again by the Supreme Court. There's a belief that that issue is already being taken care of, though, because even though the Supreme Court sent the rule back to the EPA on some pretty technical basis, most of the industry has already started to comply, and you don't notice much of a difference in your power bill as a result. And also, a lot of the oldest, dirtiest, most inefficient coal plants already have been shutting down for two reasons. Number one, fracking and the glut of low-cost natural gas.
One of the great dilemmas
when
in the
burned,
environmental
burns, emits a lot less mercury, a lot less smog and soot-forming pollutants, and also emits about half the heat-trapping carbon dioxide. There's some other issues, obviously, with fracking, but just in terms of when it's burned for electric generation, it's a heck of a lot cleaner than coal, and right now it's a lot cheaper. And I wouldn't want to forecast, long into the future, but most of the credible forecasts say that it's going to remain relatively low for quite a while. So that's driving the economy that way, and it's good for consumers because you're not paying as much necessarily for electricity as you would otherwise. Everybody agrees that electric bills are probably going to be going up over time. The kind of doom and gloom that you hear from the coal industry and its allies in Congress that it's going to bankrupt the economy and you're going to see these horrible rate increases on your electric bill, and it's especially going to help poor people of color. You heard the same things when they passed the Clean Air Act in the 1970s and later when they clamped down on air pollution that was causing acid rain in the 1990s. And none of those dire predictions actually happened.
So the real reason that we're about to lose much of the fleet of the coal-burning power plants is not really regulation. It's the forces of the economy.
That's part of it, but regulation is actually helping push this along as well, because these power companies, they're bottom line folks who are running these power companies, and they see the cost of upgrading a plant that might have been built in 1953, and as compared to perhaps overhauling it to burn natural gas, or look at the cost of wind power now. Once installed, you have no fuel cost. And even though right now it's about 4% of the national energy mix, you have states like Illinois and many other states that say that by the middle of the next century, we should be getting a quarter of our electricity from wind and other renewable sources. There's a lot of money to be invested in that. There are a lot of jobs in that.
Century?
They say now
130
no,
years.
I'm sorry. If I said century, I meant the next decade.
The next decade.
The next
Okay.
decade.
All right.
So by 2025, we're going to be getting a quarter of our electricity from renewable sources. Right now, it's about 4%.
I didn't mean to say, by the way, that I didn't think that the regulation was important. Obviously, regulation drives everything. What I'm saying is that the proclivity is to fight regulation as much as you can. But the one thing that these guys can't fight is the market. When the market tanks on them, then they're just toast, and there's nothing much they can do.
So there's money to be made in natural gas, obviously, right now, and then also in renewables. You look at these charts of the incredible increase in solar power in some states, especially sunny states in the Southwest, for example. They've got this whole issue with rooftop solar arrays, so worrying the regulated utilities that they're trying to slap extra surcharges on homeowners who are trying to make their own electricity at home because they're going to go off the grid, essentially.
One of the most amazingly regressive forces that in the history of the environmental movement is that, okay, so you want to go slightly off the grid, half off the grid, whatever it is. You want to be responsible for the generation of some of your own power, and the power companies want to tax you for doing that.
That's essentially what's been happening in states like Arizona right now.
Yeah, it's just
and Florida and places like that.
And they have governments that are willing to work with them.
But I think the bottom line on a lot of this is, most people don't think about where they get their electricity from. They want to make sure that the lights are on. And so you'll hear from the coal industry that if these climate rules are passed, that we're going to have massive blackouts and things like this. They said the same thing when the Clean Air Act was initially passed and the air started getting cleaner. We have a lot less, for example, smog in Chicago today than we once did. The air here is probably right now the cleanest it's been since the Industrial Revolution.
Since DuSable.
Since DuSable. The water's another question. But we've had 3 decades of progress in this area. What the science is saying is that the planet is in peril from these heat-trapping emissions, that we're dumping so much heat-trapping pollution, carbon dioxide, methane, things like that into the atmosphere, that it's changing our climate, changing then our weather patterns, leading to things like these massive storms that we see here in Chicago, or massive droughts that we see in places like California.
Yeah, and I think it's very important to make that distinction that these are different kinds of pollutants and they do different things. The particulate stuff that I think you could say we've been pretty successful in cleaning up over the last 30 years, that's something of a victory. But the other stuff we've not been paying attention to because you don't see it. Right? I mean, it just kind of floats up there and does its damage.
And most of the stuff,
there.
even the soot, the small particles that the science or the medical community is the most worried about, those are things you can't see either. They're so tiny now. They were so good at screening out the really big particles that left the sky looking kind of sooty, right? The London fog, things like that. It's the smaller particles that you can see that only on some days here in Chicago, if we look up and it's really hazy, that's oftentimes weather conditions are along the lake are kind of pressing the air down, and all those emissions from the diesel trucks and things like that are just kind of trapped. And if you have asthma or some other kind of breathing problem, you might suddenly find it difficult to breathe, even today.
So let's look at the plan. Barack Obama says he wants to cut those emissions that we're talking about, right? The carbon dioxide,
correct,
right? Wants to cut those emissions by 32% from where they were 10 years ago. I don't quite understand why that.
So some people would say that actually it doesn't do that much as a result.
Because we've made some progress in 10 years, right?
Oh, very much so. The recession drove down greenhouse gas emissions, and they've stayed relatively flat since then because of a number of changes, both from, we're not traveling as much, we're not driving as much as we once did. And cars are not emitting as much of that type of pollution.
So as a guy who used to write press releases, it wouldn't have looked as good to say we want to cut emissions by 15%. So if we say we want to cut them by 32%.
Some would say even less, maybe 6% when it comes down to it.
Well, anyway, but nevertheless, that's what he's going after, and his opponents on the right are just livid about it and reminding us that many people will die because of this, and we'll all be shivering in the dark.
But I think it's interesting. There was just this week a major utility executive, Dominion, mostly on the East Coast, but they owned a few power plants here in the Midwest until recently. He got up before a group of coal executives and said, hey, get used to it. This plan is probably going to survive a court challenge. And coal probably will still be, right now it's about 41% of the national energy mix. The Obama administration projects that by the time the rules are fully in effect by 2030, it'll be somewhere around the order of like 27%.
Wow.
So that'll be other sources will take the place of that, and the rules have been rewritten in the final form to try to put the emphasis on more renewable sources rather than a huge shift to natural gas. But gas is still going to play a major role.
I think another thing that we haven't taken into account here in this conversation is just the efficiency, the increases in efficiency and electrical consumption. I mean, I've bought some new appliances for our house, and you know, the refrigerators are just even in 10 years what's happened with. But the biggest thing that I don't think anybody's really talking about is LED light bulbs. I mean, you can replace a 100-watt, incandescent tungsten filament bulb with a 9-watt bulb that gives you the same light, same efficacy, everything. That's a 90% reduction in energy consumption.
Well, I think what's interesting, if you look at household energy use, and the Energy Department studies this pretty intensely, like you said, our appliances have steadily become more efficient. So you can have a giant, say, Sub-Zero refrigerator if you can afford it, and it uses less electricity than that old clunker beer fridge that your dad had out in the garage back in the 70s. Exactly, or still running in the basement. That's why ComEd, if you ever thumb through your electric bill, they have a little flyer that says they'll come let us that old beer fridge, because it's more demand on the grid.
1,000-watt refrigerator.
But other things, like, interestingly enough, like your cable box is actually right now they haven't improved the efficiency of the cable box, and there are other things in the home.
The vampires
that are energy vampires. Interestingly enough, though, a lot of people are changing over to the light bulbs. You go to Home Depot or Lowe's, you walk in now, and that's pretty much all you can buy.
I actually was in one of the aforementioned stores yesterday and saw a 2-pack of 60-watt LEDs for $4.50. So $2 a piece for an LED light bulb that was $20 2.5 years ago.
Well, and I think if you look back at the big picture here and what the president's climate rules are trying to do, and this is what he talked about when he unveiled them a week ago at the White House. He gave a little bit of environmental history and regulatory history. And we've seen this time and time again. A rule is put in place that says, okay, polluting industry, you have to do something. And we're going to set a target for you, or we're going to set a deadline. The regulated industry, the polluting industry complains, saying, oh my God, we can't do this. We
immediately
can't do
go
this.
to court.
They go to court, they do all other kinds of things. They have their friends in Congress try to do things to block the rule from taking effect. They try to beat out the clock.
Employees in Congress.
And then what ends up happening is we have really smart engineers at a lot of these companies, and they figure out a way not only to meet the target, but ultimately to do it in a very much less expensive way. So that's what we've seen with these light bulbs. You know, it wasn't too long ago that they were $30 a pop. I think we were talking about just taking, if we moved ever, we were talking about just taking them out of the house because they were so darn expensive. And the last time I went in, it's $2 a pop.
That in itself is interesting because just the cost of everything is coming down. But I think I want to kind of get back to the plan. In Illinois, we're talking about, I just wrote some things, I cribbed this from your story, 2,208 pounds of carbon dioxide per megawatt hour. And that's what we have now. And the target is 1,245. Now that's awfully geeky, but it's really not that hard to understand. A megawatt hour is 1,000,000 watts for an hour, right? If you had 100,000 of those,
something on the order of 30,000 homes or something like that, if I remember right.
Yes. So if you had lots and lots and lots of 100-watt light bulbs, it would be a megawatt. And if you burned it for an hour, that's a megawatt hour. To get a megawatt hour, you had to put. Right now, we're putting 2,200 pounds of carbon dioxide in the air. I mean, on average across the fleet of power plants.
Well, in Illinois, we have an interesting situation. We're historically a coal state, downstate mostly, and we have a lot of these old coal-fired power plants still, fewer than we once did because a number of them have already shut down. But we also have the largest nuclear fleet in the country, and ComEd, Exelon now, but ComEd, that's where we get most of our electricity from. They, as a company, have been really in favor of any kind of climate change regulations because when you generate nuclear power, you're not generating any heat-trapping carbon
and you
dioxide
didn't mention
emissions.
that they offloaded all their coal plants years ago.
Right before that, right, exactly, right. That was in the late 90s. They knew what was coming.
So Exelon is a clean energy company.
Well, relatively so. I think it's a very small percentage of their portfolio now. They've been in Springfield saying they need essentially some kind of giveaway from the ratepayers of the entire state, or otherwise they're going to be shutting down a few of their older nuclear plants or their smaller nuclear plants. Essentially what's happening right now is at night sometimes, the way the electric markets work, at night sometimes these nuclear plants that are constantly running are essentially getting negative prices for their electricity because at night wind and other things are going full tilt. They're putting a lot of electricity onto the grid, and so ComEd is not making money. They've on those plants when they have these auctions to bid in specific power plants into these auctions. Exelon's had a tough time getting some of their nuke plants into the auction.
Do you remember back in the name just escaped me now. The notorious company, the company that got into all the trouble in California.
Enron.
Enron. Thank you very much. At the time of the Enron collapse, there were serious conversations about the fact that we would never be able to have enough power in the United States. That we were just running short of power.
I think you already answered that question. Efficiency is a big thing that's happened here. The climate rules that the president rolled out last week don't say anything about energy efficiency in terms of setting an actual goal, but it does say that individual states, like Illinois, can use energy efficiency to get to that target,
so
that
2030
target.
Mix.
And we already have legislation on the books here in Illinois where we're supposed to be reducing demand by about 2% a year. The environmental advocates are down in Springfield saying that the law is not working as intended. They need some fixes there. Same thing with the renewable energy part. If you talk to most smart people who are looking at energy in Illinois, we're not going to have a tough time meeting this goal, meeting this target. In part because we have a lot of nuclear power, also because we're ramping up our reliance on carbon-free wind energy, but also we have other things going on where there's this company, NRG, that bought a lot of the old ComEd coal plants. They're planning to turn a big plant out in Joliet to natural gas. That right there will get us a long way toward meeting that reduction target in the climate rules. And if a couple of other plants shut down or a couple of other units shut down, some of the more inefficient units, we're probably there by the middle of the next decade or early part of the next
Quoting
decade.
yourself, back to yourself, NRG's NRG's coal plants could account for half of the state goal, just those plants alone.
Right.
So, I mean, you almost could ask if we're not just like we haven't set the goal high enough here. Let's go for more. But it very well could be that the market. This is one of these places where the market is just driving it down on its own, not intentionally. That's just what's happening.
And I think what the rules, several people that I've talked to about this, what they've said is that essentially what these rules do is kind of lock in what's already happened and nudged the industry and the energy economy in a cleaner direction.
Yeah. Oh, we could do this all day. We haven't really talked about fracking and just the whole irony of nuclear power coming to the fore as being one of the things that, is saving us. We're all relying on it.
It's probably going to save those nuclear plants. Building a new one is still very expensive, so whether that happens is another question.
So many of them should have been decommissioned years ago, and they're still cranking away, right?
They were recommissioned.
Yeah, recommissioned.
In many cases, relicensed.
Yeah. You wrote some very important stuff about lead poisoning, and we're doing it a disservice by cramming it into the end here. But just go talk to me about lead poisoning and how it's affecting the minority and underserved communities in Chicago.
Well, I came at it initially because I'm interested in why we keep having this violence problem. in our poorest neighborhoods. 2012 was an incredibly violent year here in Chicago. National headlines for the uptick in murders. And there's a lot of compelling research that links lead exposure early in life with first problems in school, and then later a life of crime, and especially violent crime. A really interesting study in Cincinnati where they've been following people since the late 70s. And if you were poisoned by lead as a child, even small amounts of lead, much smaller than what we were talking about when this was a big issue in Chicago in the 1970s and 60s, very small amounts of that can permanently alter the chemistry of the brain or the makeup of the brain, and especially in areas that deal with executive functions like judgment and emotional control. And so you have a situation where kids end up doing very poorly in school, in part because of what's happened to their brain early in life through no fault of their own. And then in the case of these kids that were followed and now adults in Cincinnati, they're more likely to be in prison and have committed violent crimes later in life. And I got to thinking that could this lead problem, this historic lead problem that we've had here in Chicago, because we have a lot of older housing pre-1978 when lead paint was banned in this country, could that be part of what's going on? And so I got data from the city by census tract. And if you look at over time from 1995 to 2013, if you look at 1995 and the current level that the CDC says, well, there should be some kind of intervention in a kid's life. It's a wonky number, but it's 5 micrograms of lead per deciliter of blood. If you look at 1995, almost the entire city had a problem with lead at that point. Even places like Lincoln Park. We had a lot of older housing at that point with a lot of old lead paint on the windowsills and the porches and things like that.
Run the window up and down.
You flash forward, we did our guys in our apps team did a great animated map, and you flash forward through time to 2013, and this problem has been largely taken care of in the more wealthy neighborhoods of Chicago. There's a census tract in Lincoln Park and another one that I looked at in Austin on the west side. In 1995, they had about the same amount of kids that were poisoned by lead. You flash forward to 2013, there's almost no lead poisoning at all. I think there was none actually that year in this one tract around DePaul University in Lincoln Park. You go over to Austin on the west side, and a quarter of the kids tested that year have elevated levels of lead in their body. So we're essentially sentencing these kids
it's amazing.
To a potential, we're setting them on a course where they have a lot of other things going against them in terms of poverty and family structure and the horrible schools in those areas. But a lot of scientists are looking at this, and sociologists who have been looking at this for a long time and looking at certain neighborhoods like Englewood and Austin. They look at things like what happened with housing discrimination and the flight of factory jobs to other countries and other states. And they think, look, this is the one thing we've missed out on is lead. Lead and our continued problem with lead poisoning and lead-based paint in this city is essentially we're missing the kind of the low-hanging fruit. And in an era where the Congress has significantly reduced the amount of money going to identifying kids who are lead poisoning and then doing something about it, and the city budget for lead poisoning has dropped significantly. So you've got a major problem on our hands that we could probably help address if we did something about it and invested in it.
And that's a beautiful conclusion. It's something we got to do. I really strongly advise you look up Michael Hawthorne in the Tribune. Just go online and look up all his articles. They are great, and they really cover a lot of interesting things. Michael, thank you for being with us today on the Chicago Newsroom. That's what you've been watching, Chicago Newsroom, community service of CAN TV. You can watch us on TV, or you can watch us here anytime you want at this address, or subscribe to our podcast, and I hope you will. See you next week with another program. I'm Ken Davis. Thanks very much for watching Chicago Newsroom. Bye.